Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now in today's one we're going to be catching up with our old friend the GTX 1060. This is the 6GB version of the card. It launched in 2016 for $249, the Founders Edition was available for $299, and then we also had a 3GB version for $199, which is what I had, and it's the card we'll be comparing this one to in another video. But today it's all about the better of the two, the proper 1060 as some might like to call it, the 6GB card. How well does it do these days? Well, let's jump into a few benchmarks with this Gigabyte G1 Gaming Edition and take a look. I've tried to find a nice balance between visuals and performance throughout, so I haven't been targeting 60 for all the benchmarks, and in some cases we would have had to make too much of a sacrifice to do so. A good example of that is Alan Wake 2, where we'll start 1080p with FSR2 set to quality and the lowest settings for 45 frames per second. This is actually a lot better than I thought, though at native 1080p it was about 20 to 25 FPS at best, so we definitely need some form of upscaling here. The 1% low was 36 and the 0.1% low was 29, so it wasn't bad in terms of consistency either. If you want to play Apex Legends on a 1060 6GB in 2024, well of course it will still run absolutely fine even with the highest settings. This was perhaps a little bit ambitious, especially for those of you wanting to target 120 FPS, but with the very high textures, everything else set to max and TSAA. The only thing off, in fact, was spot shadows. We saw 104 frames per second, a 1% low of 78 and a 0.1% low of 56. So you're not really going to see any dips below 60 in this one. Baldur's Gate 3 1080p with the medium preset and TAA. I feel like I could have enabled some form of upscaling here to push it over 60, but this is one of those titles in my opinion that doesn't really need to be played at least 60 FPS, though I think the option is there if you want it to be either through slightly lower settings or with some help from the aforementioned upscaling. As it was though, 1080p native, 53 FPS with a 1% low of 39 and a 0.1% low of 17. As usual there are a few dips and drops in and around the city, but I've experienced this on a lot of different hardware. We have the Black Myth benchmark tool next. I've still not got around to buying the full game, but I will do at some point. At 1080p with FSR set to 80% scaling and the low preset, I was anticipating a slightly above 30 FPS average here, but it did better than I thought with 44. The 1% low was 38 and the 0.1% low was 29. There is quite a visual difference between low and medium, but there's also quite a performance difference as well, and medium will have things crawling to a bit of a halt. That's probably an over-exaggeration. You're talking slightly above 30 FPS with frequent dips below if you turn the preset up any higher. Warzone up next, 1080p with FSR3 set to balanced mode and the balanced in-game preset. This is a lot more demanding than I remember, but perhaps as the card ages and the game receives more updates, it's going to be a bit more intensive. Who knows, but on average 69 FPS with a 1% low of 55 and a 0.1% low of 37. As I said before, it was a bit more demanding than I remember it being, but I have to remember that the 1060 itself is no spring chicken. This is an 8-year-old card now, and for some reason I like to think of it as one of those cards that will always be good. I think, I want to play a game, I'll just slap a 1060 in the system, it'll be fine, right? I have to think that mainstream 8 years ago is not mainstream today. Counter-Strike 2 next, 1080p medium preset with anti-aliasing off because this will default to MSAA and it'll also default to some form of FSR as well with the medium preset, but here with all of that off, 240 FPS overall with a 1% low of 96 and a 0.1% figure of 64. Cyberpunk 2077 next. I had FSR3 enabled here, a newly added feature to the game. It was set to quality mode and I also had the low preset selected with medium textures. Now the low preset won't turn everything down to low, it'll actually keep a few things at medium, so it will look a little bit better, especially when we bump the texture resolution up as well. However, there will be frequent drops below 60 FPS. This can be said at all of the available in-game settings, to be fair, unless we use a more aggressive form of upscaling, perhaps switch to FSR 2.1 instead. 62 FPS however was the average, so we still broke that 60 FPS barrier here. The 1% low was 38 and the 0.1% low was 26. Not a bad effort for this near decade old card, which can now be found for a lot less than £100 or dollars on used selling sites. Elden Ring, with the default 60 FPS cap left in place with the medium preset, had no trouble hitting 60 FPS. I think we could have probably turned it up a little higher, but this was definitely the way to play in my opinion. A 1% low of 45 accompanied this average, as did a 0.1% figure of 34. Fortnite next, left in default DX11 mode with 1080p of course. This is very much a 1080p or lower gaming card in 2024. We also had the medium preset and TAA for a nice average of 115 FPS, so very smooth in terms of the overall figure. A few dips and drops as represented by the percentile lows, but overall Fortnite was more than playable on this mainstream legend, which unfortunately is finding its way down the Steam hardware survey at an ever increasing rate. I remember when this was holding the top spot for absolutely ages. Forza Horizon 5 up next, no troubles in exceeding 60 frames per second at the high preset here with TAA. 74 was the average FPS, the 1% low was 59 and the 0.1% low was 40. A very good looking game and one that runs really well on this 6GB GPU. As I mentioned at the start, we'll have a comparison to the 3GB card coming soon. It'll be interesting to see how they both compare in 2024, especially when I said back in the day that the 3GB one was more than enough, at least for my needs. Definitely not the case today, I don't think, for a lot of people, but we'll have to wait and see. Helldivers 2 up next, 1080p with the lowest settings and anti-aliasing switched on. This did better than I thought, especially considering we didn't have any form of upscaling enabled, so this is pure native 1080p here with 68 FPS on average. Our 1% low was 47 and our 0.1% low was 36. This game looks absolutely fantastic in my opinion, especially at dusk here. Could just be space dust, who knows, but yeah, at least 60 FPS, a very nice result for Helldivers 2 with the GTX 1060, one of my all-time favourite GPUs, as well as the 1080 Ti, 750 Ti and 1050 Ti. Love all those cards. And the Radeon 5670, which was my first, I guess you could say, proper GPU. Once human next, 1080p with a low preset for 83 FPS. Probably could have pushed this one a bit higher actually, but there will be moments when we see drops towards the upper end or lower end of 60, so I feel like low was a good place to be. Still looks okay to be fair. We got 83 as the average, 60 FPS as the 1% low, and the 0.1% low was 33. We'll finalise then with Starfield. No we won't. This is the penultimate result. We have Red Dead after this, but Starfield 1080p FSR3 enabled with 70% scaling. To try and hit 60 FPS it would have been too much of a visual sacrifice. It would have been like looking at a really blurry mess, so FSR3 70% with the lowest settings for 42 frames per second, a 1% low of 34 and a 0.1% low of 27. Red Dead Redemption 2 to finalise then, 1080p with the Xbox One X equivalent settings for 54 frames per second. Again, this one runs at 30 FPS still on consoles, so I think this is a decent and acceptable average, especially for this card which came out in 2016. The 1% low was 41 and the 0.1% figure was 30. But there we go, the legendary 1060 in 2024. We'll have a few more videos featuring this card this week, running a few comparisons with it, but as for this one, thanks for watching. Leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel as well if you haven't done so already and you want to of course, and I'll see you all next time.